Hi everyone, welcome to now the 12th 5 Paper Buildings webinar. It's been the 12th of absolutely many fantastic webinars, many of which are available on Crimeline. As you know, you can access them there, and also we're developing a YouTube channel at the moment. Today we have Dominic Lewis, who's going to talk to us about the coronavirus regulations and give us an update as to that. It's a shorter webinar, but no less useful. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Dom, who's going to talk us through it.
Thanks very much, Josh. Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
And hopefully you should have a slide up on the screen, which I can see now. And you've got the old title of the regulations up there crossed out. Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions England Regulations 2020, number 350. And they've been replaced with the snappily titled similar regulations with the number 2 slotted in there in the middle. This is the fourth in an occasional series of updates as the laws changed gradually since late March when it was first introduced. And there have been some fairly significant changes in this one. The law is changing pretty rapidly, and this is as at the 4th of July. Do you have that on the screen? Yeah. So this is the law in force as at the 4th of July in England. I'm going to be focusing, as before, on the law relating to gatherings and the restrictions on gatherings. And there are exceptions now relating to Leicester, which I'm not going to touch upon, save to flag up that they exist. It goes without saying, this is the caveat I've referred to previously in these talks. Everything that follows isn't public health advice. This is my analysis. It might be right, might be wrong. Hopefully it's right. My analysis of the legal status of the various restrictions. But the government guidance currently advises against an increasingly wide range of conduct that is not actually prohibited in law. You have the link there on that first title page, and it'll be repeated at the end. And the important thing, plainly, for all of us in our lives is to comply with the public health guidance. So this is a webinar about the law and what you can and can't do under that. And so if we have the next slide, we can just look at the development and the reasons for it over the last few months. So the first set of regulations were in force from the 26th of March, and that's defined as the start of the emergency period for these purposes. I might refer to them as the old regulations. The language in the new regs is that they were the first regulations, so I may use those terms interchangeably, but they're the ones that were previously in force in England to deal with the spread of the coronavirus. There's been a requirement to review them at least once every 28 days. And under Regulation 3.3, as you see there, if any of the restrictions or any of the requirements are no longer necessary, then they needed to be terminated. The specified purpose or the focus of these regulations is to prevent, protect against, control or provide a public health response to the incidence or spread of infection in England with the coronavirus. And so that's been the focus of the regulations throughout. And if we go to the next slide, we can have a look at the just very quickly the various changes. So there have been 5 previous versions of regulations dealing with these restrictions, called the lockdown restrictions colloquially, and you can see they've changed there roughly every sort of 3 or 4 weeks, and the restrictions have been relaxed at an increasingly rapid pace as progress appears to have been made in responding to the public health crisis. The most recent set of regs prior to the current lot were made on the 15th of June. If we go to the next slide, we'll see what's happened to them all. They've now all gone. And so we don't need to worry about updating previous versions of regulations anymore because they've all been repealed effectively and replaced with the number 2 regs. And so turning to the next slide, I think just makes that point. So as of the 4th of July of this year, midnight in some cases, 1 AM in others, 6 AM in others, I think, The previous regulations were repealed in their entirety, save for one provision which simply repealed previous regulations itself. This webinar is focusing principally on gatherings, so it's not covering business premises opening and so on. Focuses on gatherings in England. And there are separate regulations, as I've already touched upon, dealing with the situation in Leicester. They, broadly speaking, mirror the position in the June 15 version of previous regs that apply everywhere else. I'm not going to be looking at those at all, so everything else comes with that caveat. If we go to the next slide, we'll have a look, I think, at the old Regulation 6. So when the first set of regulations came into force, this was the most draconian or sweeping restriction on liberty that I think anyone had ever seen, pretty much to remind ourselves where we were and how we've got to where we are now. If we look at that wording there, during the emergency period, starting on the 26th of March, no person may leave the place where they were living without reasonable excuse. So that's the original version of Regulation 6.1, later amended to catch situations where your reasonable excuse expired while you were out. That was then relaxed on the 1st of June to permit you to leave the house for any particular reason, but you couldn't stay overnight at any other place without a reasonable excuse. And there were a list of indicative reasonable excuses. It wasn't an exhaustive list. But that restriction on moving, the restriction on leaving your house, the restriction on staying elsewhere, legally has now been revoked in its entirety outside Leicester. And if we go to the next page, we can see what that means. So you can now legally leave your home for any purpose. You don't need to come within one of the specified reasonable excuses. You can stay out for as long as you like during any given day and do, subject to other legal provisions, pretty much what you want. And you can stay overnight anywhere you like with whoever you like. So it's a bit like when you became a grown-up and you moved out of your parents' house. And this shouldn't feel strange, this shouldn't be striking. But when I first read the new set of regulations, I thought, crikey, we were almost back to normal. As I say, that is the legal position. And of course, the guidance remains quite different from that. Towards the end of this webinar, I have a little few things to say about what it means for the guidance and the regulations to be so divergent. But this is effectively where we are legally. So there's no restriction on movement under the old Regulation 6 anymore. Well, the other significant regulation under the old regs was Regulation 7, which restricted the scope for gathering. And we'll have a look at that now on the next slide, please, Josh. So a gathering was defined in due course in the old regulations as per the screen there, when two or more people are present together in the same place in order to engage in any form of social interaction with each other or to undertake any other activity with each other. And those terms, social interaction and any other activity, are deliberately broad, deliberately wider than terms that were previously used, such as exercise or recreation and so on, and designed really to catch pretty much any kind of behaviour that two or more people would want to engage in together, from a simple cup of tea to chat to much more involved forms of activity. If we skip onto the next slide, we can see what you used to be prohibited from doing. When the old Regulation 7 first came into force, it restricted gatherings to a maximum of 2 people in a public place, save where you could bring yourself within an exhaustive list of exceptions. That was relaxed on the 1st of June to permit gatherings outdoors of up to 6 people, but indoors there's still considerable restrictions. Broadly speaking, 2 people could not gather together indoors if they were from separate households, unless they came within certain other specified exceptions. And this provision was further relaxed on the 15th of June, where the concept of linked households was introduced, by which effectively a single parent household or one adult living alone could link with another household of whatever size, and they could treat themselves as one household, effectively as one bubble, so they could stay overnight and they could gather without restriction, broadly speaking. But for now, the linked households concept is only relevant to the restrictions that are in force in Leicester. So that was the old Regulation 7 and how it developed over the last few months. And if we go on to the next slide, I think we'll see where we are now. Yeah, so that regulation has been repealed in its entirety, along with the rest of the previous regs. It's been replaced with what is now Regulation 5.1. And that provides as follows. During the emergency period, which we are of course still within, unless paragraph 3 applies, we come to that, no person may participate in a gathering which consists of more than 30 persons and takes place in a private dwelling, including a houseboat, or on a vessel other than a houseboat, etc., or on land which satisfies the condition in paragraph 2. There's quite a lot about boats for presumably technical reasons in the regulations, but it may not be that relevant to most of us. Regulation 5.2, just to pick up on the condition in paragraph 2 referred to there. Regulation 5.2 refers to a public outdoor place which is not operated effectively as a visitor attraction or part of premises used for the operation of a business, charitable, benevolent or philanthropic institution, or a public body. I think there's a typo in there, my fault. So effectively, Regulation 5.2 catches parks, pavements, public, your typical public spaces, I suppose, pedestrianised high streets and the like. Going over the page, before we sort of step back and take stock of where this all leaves us, Regulation 5.3 provides a list of exceptions, and these are exceptions which permit gatherings of over 30 people. Okay, so this is the number we're talking about. Over 30 people in a private dwelling or in a public outdoor place. And you can have such a gathering, a large gathering, just to use shorthand, if it's been organised by a business or charitable institution and so on, or a public or political body, and a risk assessment has been carried out, and all reasonable measures have been taken to limit the risk of transmission of coronavirus. And in assessing whether or not all reasonable measures have been taken into account, then the test, or the touchstone, at least to some extent, is going to be the current guidance, or the then current guidance issued by the government. So that's an exception. If you're an elite sports person and the gathering is necessary for training or competition, again, more than 30 of you can gather together, either in a private dwelling or in a public outdoor space. Another exception is the sort of now relatively familiar bunch of exceptions, or bracket of exceptions, that have been used throughout to permit certain otherwise prohibited conduct, if the gathering is reasonably necessary for work or education or childcare, to provide emergency assistance, or to avoid injury, illness, or escape the risk of harm. And there's a further exception if you're fulfilling a legal obligation. Again, 30 people or more can gather in a private dwelling or public outdoor place if any of those exceptions apply. So that's all quite a big change. If we go over to the next slide, we can have a look, I think, at where that leaves us. Yeah, so stepping back, what's it all mean? Well, up to 30 people can now gather pretty much anywhere, for any purpose, for any length of time, including overnight. Again, Leicester discounted. And over 30 people can gather together in a wide range of circumstances, including indoors, anywhere that's not a private dwelling. So, for example, a large wedding would be legally possible. Whether it would be advisable for the reasons is an entirely different matter, but this is the legal parameters. A large wedding would be legally possible, as would, for example, a full church service. Raves get a specific mention, sort of nostalgically perhaps, in new regulations, and plainly topically because of activities over the last few weeks in Manchester and other places. So outdoor raves, or outdoor overnight parties involving music, are likely to be caught by the prohibition on over 30 people gathering on public land, at least if they're any good. And Regulation 6.4, so that's my type, is Regulation 5.4 in fact, prohibits indoor gatherings of over 30 people, which would fall within terms of Section 63(1) of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994. And that was the somewhat controversial legislation that was designed specifically to restrict access to raves and to prohibit them. And the specific type of music that was targeted there was music that was characterised by a succession of repetitive beats. So it's bad news for fans of Steve Reich, among others, from that. But by and large, there's a considerable relaxation there on any view in the legal restrictions that were previously in force. And what's interesting about that is to compare it to the guidance that's issued. It's the link in the first page. We don't need to look at it now. To compare the legal lifting of restrictions with the guidance. And paragraphs 1.5 and 1.6 of the guidance suggest that the scope of permission is that you're able to meet indoors in groups of up to 2 households, and that you're allowed to meet outdoors in groups of up to 6 people who you don't live with and who aren't in your support bubble. I think that's far more restrictive than what's now permitted in law, but that's very much still the type of the scope of relaxation that's advisable on public health grounds, according to the government. As I say, I'll look at the perhaps problems created by that divergence a little later on. All of these relaxations are subject to a new power that the Secretary of State has been granted to restrict access to public places, and we'll look at that now. It's in the new Regulation 6, if we go over the page. So this closing the beach is my easy way of remembering what this regulation potentially covers. So that's the new Regulation 6.1 up on the screen. The Secretary of State may, by direction, restrict access to a specified public outdoor place or to places of a specified description if he, it's currently a he, of course, considers that giving such a direction responds to a serious and imminent threat to public health and is necessary to prevent, protect against, control or provide a public health response, and so on, as per the steer in Regulation 3.3. There also needs to be a consideration of proportionality, but plainly anything that is necessary to provide a public health response to the spread of infection of the coronavirus is relatively likely to meet the test of proportionality at the present time, one might have thought, but still it's a 2-stage test there. If we go over the page, we get a bit more detail about the potential scope of Regulation 6. So the Secretary of State can prohibit all access or prohibit access at specific times. There's a requirement on him to consult either the Chief Medical Officer or the Deputy Chief Medical Officer before making such a direction. There's a right of appeal to the Magistrates' Court from the owner or the occupier of the land that's sought to be restricted, and has been restricted. The appeal is backdated effectively. The need for restrictions must in any event be reviewed at least once every 7 days if they're imposed. There's an obligation placed on the local authority as well as the owner of the land, if there is a separate owner, and those responsible for the restricted area, to take reasonable steps to restrict public access. And perhaps more relevant to those who don't own beaches and so on, there's a prohibition on anyone entering or remaining in the restricted area while the direction is in effect without a reasonable excuse. And the reasonable excuses that are listed, they're not exhaustive examples, but they're the typical ones that we're now familiar with. So, for example, to facilitate contact arrangements, if you need to go to or cross this land for work purposes, or to avoid illness, injury, escape risk of harm, and there are some others following the typical model. So that's a new power that's been granted to the Secretary of State, pretty wide-ranging, and presumably the effect of that taken with the relaxation in Regulation 5 is that if things do get out of hand in particular locations on a regular basis, the Secretary of State can say, well, simply you're not allowed to gather there for the time being, and that is the new, I suppose, method of controlling that type of threat to public health. If we go to the next slide, there's a bit about enforcement on the next slide. Yeah, so broadly speaking, the regulations dealing with enforcement, offences and penalties follow the model of the previous regs. So a relevant person, who will typically be a constable, although others are empowered, can take such action as is necessary to enforce requirements imposed by the regs, including those relating to closure of businesses and premises and those relating to gathering and so on. Broadly speaking, it's a criminal offence to contravene any of the above regulations without reasonable excuse, or to obstruct any person carrying out a function under those regulations. These are all summary-only offences. The maximum penalty, however, is an unlimited fine. It can be applied to corporates as well as private individuals. There's also retention of the power to issue fixed penalty notices to over 18s, and the scale is as per before, starts at £100 for a first offence, halved for early payment, and rises on subsequent offences to a maximum of £3,200 that can be imposed under a fixed penalty notice. Plainly, if you get to that stage, it may well be that the police have stopped issuing fixed penalty notices and moved to prosecution, but that's at least a power permitted to them to issue a fixed penalty notice requiring you to pay a £3,200 fine for the, I think it's about the 6th instance of breaching the regulations. If we go over the page, take a step back and look at what all this means. So almost as quickly as it came in, it seems that legally, at least, I do stress that of course, the lockdown is all but over in relation to freedom of movement, and to a pretty significant extent in relation to freedom of assembly as well. There are of course still restrictions on businesses and other premises, and those restrictions limit the scope for activity there in Regulation 4 and Schedule 2, and so just flicking through them, you'll be relatively familiar. But the types of businesses that still aren't allowed to open include nightclubs, casinos, spas, indoor and outdoor swimming pools, play areas that are indoors, soft play areas and so on, and indoor gyms, etc. Maybe there's some relaxation in the next few weeks, but there's still some restrictions there. But in terms of the restrictions on personal liberty, where you can go, who you can meet, and so on, they have been to a very significant extent relaxed under the number 2 regulations. Worth bearing in mind, however, that we've seen examples already of restrictions being tightened again post-relaxation. Local lockdowns, they're referred to colloquially, and so Leicester is now subject to its own specific set of regulations which mirror the previous version to a significant extent that the rest of England was subject to back from the 15th of June. Melbourne to parts of Spain, some of the southern states in America. And so there's plenty scope for the restrictions to be tightened again, which is worth bearing in mind. We may need to go back to concepts such as linked households and so on in due course, but that's where the law stands at present. But what is interesting is the divergence between what the law permits and what the guidance advises should be done, because there's always been a divergence to some extent in that the law has always been a bit more permissive than the guidance, playing the right way round. It's widened to quite a significant extent, to the extent that when I read the new regulations, I thought I must have got something wrong. Maybe I have got something wrong, but I must have got something wrong, because they didn't accord in any way really with the guidance that was being widely publicised. And over the next page, I just want to take a look at whether or not that's a problem, and if it's not, why it might not be. So there's the question: is it a problem, this divergence between the law and guidance? And plainly there's scope for a difference of opinion on this, and plainly there's scope for strong views about what the law ought to be doing, whether sowing confusion does more harm than good, and so on. And of course, typically, it's incredibly important. We want to be able to regulate their behaviour using the law as a touchstone. Article 7, of course, deals with legal certainty. Equally as common sense. If you don't know what the law is, how can you comply with it? How can you regulate your behaviour? And of course, the conflict between the law and the guidance complicates this. For what it's worth, probably not too much, my personal view is that in this instance, the existence and most importantly the widespread publication and publicisation of the guidance really minimises the extent to which this is a problem. By and large, people are quite probably following the guidance rather than the law. They're modelling their behaviour on what they're being told you should do, not the maximum that you can do. And if you follow the guidance, it seems to me, there may be exceptions to this, I don't think there are, but it seems to me that if you follow the guidance, comply with that, you cannot be in contravention of the law, because the law is by and large more permissive than the guidance. And so you're not at peril of criminalisation, provided you're following the guidance that is out there that we're all, broadly speaking, familiar with, and if not, we know where to check. Of course, there needs to be a legal backbone in order to enforce in the minority of cases where particularly egregious breaches take place and where there's real serious risk being presented, perhaps on an ongoing basis, to public health. But the purpose of these regulations is not, as it seems to me, to seek to nudge behaviour or to regulate human behaviour. That's the purpose of the guidance. The purpose of the regulations is as a spine there to act as a reinforcement if these particularly serious breaches do take place. And the hope will plainly be that the law doesn't need to be enforced because everyone understands the importance of following the public health advice for what it's worth. I think by and large that is working as a strategy, but I can well understand that there's scope for pretty heated and different opinion about that topic. If we go over the page, the bullet point, follow the public health advice, can be found there, already linked to it once or already. Don't just test the law to its boundaries, that's it's never any way to conduct ourselves anyway, but particularly not in the present situation. There are likely to be further changes to the law in due course. If you want to track them, then I'm sure we'll meet again in a few weeks' time. The slides from this will be made available. If there are any questions, if anyone's watching, hello on, then feel free to ping them in now. But failing which, keep yourselves safe, and I'll see you next time.
There we are. Thanks, Dom, for that. There is a question for you, which is made of a number of different questions, which is actually quite interesting, from Sam March. So I'm going to pose the question, and then I'll bring you on to answer it. The question is, what does this mean for protests of over 30 people? Can a decentralised group like Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter be a political body? Would they need to do health and safety assessments in order to protest lawfully? And could Regulation 6 be used to ban protests? So let's break that down. First question then, what does this mean for protests of over 30 people?
Well, on the face of it, unless they can be brought under any of the exceptions, they are prohibited to the extent that they take place either in a private dwelling or in a public outdoor space. So on the face of it, they are no more permitted than they would have been prior to this, although over 30 people can gather outside of a private dwelling and outside of a public outdoor space. So there will still be some scope for that, but realistically protests take place, of course, in public outdoor spaces. That's so practically they would need to seek to bring themselves under one of the exceptions. The next question I see is, can a decentralised group like Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter be a political body? That I simply don't know the answer to. I'm not. I would have thought that there would be difficulties with describing such groups as political bodies, because there's a risk that the scope of the concept of a political body is widened beyond reasonable control. I don't think the answer to that is in the regulations. I've just had a quick look at Regulation 1, which gives a number of definitions, but political body is not specifically defined for the purposes of these regulations. It may be that with a bit of time I could look that up and find an answer. But my hunch would be, for what it's worth, plainly, again, not very much probably, my hunch would be that they would not come within the description of political body here. I may be wrong about that. If they were, they would need to do health and safety assessments in order to protest lawfully. Yes, and they'd need to comply with the government guidance. Whether Regulation 6 could be used to ban protests, not directly, but plainly, if one wanted to protest in a particular place, then a direction under Regulation 6 could restrict access to that place. But the Secretary of State wouldn't be able to restrict access to that place for the purpose of banning political protest. There's pretty tightly constrained power there, because the Secretary of State could only give such a direction if it were considered to be necessary to prevent, etc., the spread of coronavirus, and that it was proportionate to achieving that purpose. So certainly you couldn't have a Section 6 direction for the purposes of banning protest. So I think that answers a few of those questions, but not probably the most significant and interesting one. So sorry about that, Sam, but I'll have a look at that, and if you want to get in touch afterwards, then I'll let you know my thoughts. Hello again. This is just a short update to the webinar that I gave yesterday in relation to the new Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions number 2 England Regulations 2020, and it'll probably only really make sense if you've seen yesterday's webinar, which you should be able to find in about the same place as this is. And the purpose of this webinar, this short addendum, if you like, is simply to answer a few questions that cropped up at the end of yesterday's session, and to do that with reference to a couple of slides that might make it easier for us all to navigate our way around this. So if I click onto the next slide, just so we orientate ourselves again, we were looking yesterday at the new Regulation 5.1, the previous regs having been abolished or repealed, and this regulation deals with the restriction on gatherings as it now applies in England, apart from Leicester and the Leicester area. And essentially there's a prohibition now on gatherings involving more than 30 people, which take place either in a private dwelling or in a public outdoor place, and we're thinking parks, pavements, public squares, and so on in terms of public outdoor space. So broadly speaking, up to 30 people can gather for pretty much any reason in a private dwelling or a public outdoor place, but above 30 people, you need to bring yourselves within the exception which is contained in Regulation 5.3. We see that on the next slide here, the 5.3 exception, and I'm only dealing with the part that's relevant to the questions that were asked yesterday. There are other exceptions dealing with work and so on. But the specific exceptions here relate to a gathering of over 30 people that's been organised by a business or a charitable or benevolent or philanthropic institution or a public or political body. And those gatherings of over 30 people in a private dwelling or public outdoor space are permitted if a risk assessment's been carried out and all reasonable measures have been taken by the event organiser or the organiser of the gathering to limit the risk of transmission of coronavirus. And in assessing whether all reasonable measures have been taken into account, we need to look at the current HMG guidance as to how those gatherings should safely operate, and the types of things that are being referred to there are, of course, the social distancing measures that they don't have legal effect. It's never been a criminal offence to get within 2 metres of somebody throughout the life of the various regulations, but plainly that's part of the guidance that needs to be taken into account when looking at whether reasonable measures have been taken. So that's the Regulation 5.3a exception. You can organise a large gathering, more than 30 people, if you meet these criteria. The other regulation, the new one we were looking at yesterday, was the new Regulation 6, which provides that the Secretary of State can restrict access to specified public outdoor places if he satisfies himself that certain conditions are met. And so it's with reference to those regulations that a few questions were asked at the end of yesterday's webinar. So this is an attempt to answer those with reference to some of the source material. So the questions, and these aren't verbatim, but these are broadly speaking, I hope, covering the topics that were asked about. The first one was whether there's an exception made in the new regulations allowing groups of more than 30 people to gather for the purpose of protest. And the short answer, which I think I gave yesterday in any event, is no. There's no specific carve out for that purpose. And so if you want to organise a gathering of more than 30 people, either in a private dwelling or a public outdoor place, then you'd need to come within the Regulation 5.3 exceptions we just looked at. The second question that was asked, which plainly relates to that, is would Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion be considered to be a political body for the purposes of Regulation 5.3? Because skipping back, if we remind ourselves, you can have a large gathering of over 30 people if it's been organised by, among others, a political body and the various criteria have been met. So the question, would these entities be considered to be political bodies for these purposes? The answer, without knowing a bit more about the structure and precisely how we'll characterise their specific aims, the answer, typical lawyer's answer, is possibly, for the reasons given on the next slide, which I'll go to. But essentially, political body is it's a broader definition than simply political party, and we have the definition here. I wasn't able to find it yesterday afternoon, but here it is. It's Regulation 5.7c in the new regs, and it's defined as below. So either a political party registered under the 2000 Act, or a political campaigning organisation within the meaning of Regulation 2 of the Health and Social Care Financial Assistance Regulations 2009. Just on the assumption we don't all have those at our fingertips, there it is on the screen. So Regulation 2 gives the definition for political campaigning organisation as set out there. Any person, and that would include a legal person of course, carrying on or proposing to carry on activities to promote or oppose changes in any law applicable in the United Kingdom or elsewhere, or any policy of a governmental or public authority, unless those activities are incidental to other activities carried on by that person. There's another sort of sub-definition of political campaigning organisation, but probably the most relevant for purposes of considering this question are those in Regulation 2A. So if you're promoting or opposing changes in the policy of a governmental or public authority, then you're brought within the category there of political campaigning organisation. And so on the face of it, there's certainly an argument that entities such as Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter, if they're sufficiently defined and if their purposes are sufficiently defined, they may be able to, on the face of it, bring themselves within that definition of political body. That's not a conclusive answer because, of course, we need to look in a lot more detail about the structure of these entities, the purpose of the specific gathering, perhaps that was being organised, and the specific requests or policies or ideals that were being proposed at the time, but in the scope at least, what one would have thought for the argument to be made that Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion may well be considered to be a political body for the purposes of Regulation 5.3. And so there was a follow-on question from that, which was if they were, and if they organised a gathering of more than 30 people in a public outdoor place, likely to be where protests happen, of course, would they need to carry out a risk assessment and would they need to take all reasonable measures to limit the spread of the coronavirus? The short answer to that is yes. The obligation there is on the gathering organiser under Regulation 5.3, and you'd need to take into account the up-to-date guidance for the purposes of complying with Regulation 5.5. So yes, the short answer to that one. And then finally a spin-off question really, which was would the Secretary of State be able to make a Regulation 6.1 direction for the purpose of preventing protest? Regulation 6.1, closing the beach regulation, in my argo, but that's the provision that allows the Secretary of State to say this park, for example, is closed until further notice. that power could not be exercised for the purpose of preventing protest, because the purposes for which such a direction can be made are clearly limited by Regulation 6.1. We see that here. It can only be made, such a direction, if the Secretary of State considers that it responds to a serious and imminent threat to public health and is necessary to prevent, protect against, etc., the spread of infection of the coronavirus, and also, secondary criteria, the restrictions are a proportionate means of achieving that purpose. So plainly there's a steer as to how that power is to be exercised, and that would not be broad enough to permit restriction of access to a public outdoor place for the purpose of preventing protest. There may be an ancillary effect, of course, of any restriction direction that is properly made, but it can't be the purpose of making such a description direction. So there we are. That's my attempt to answer with a bit of reference to the law, the 4 questions asked yesterday, with a view to assisting and bringing a bit of clarification to what is still a relatively fiddly area of legislation, rapidly changing, because of course pretty much as soon as I finished my talk yesterday, the government announced that in a few weeks' time beauty salons and gyms and swimming pools and so on are going to be opening. So legislation is keeping pace, accelerating past the pace at which I can keep up. But there are a nice problem to have if it means that everything is getting back to normal. So there you are, not legal advice that, but just an attempt to answer some of those questions. So I hope that's helpful, and there may be more updates in due course. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Dominic. Really interesting talk there. We'll try and make that available either on YouTube, possibly on Crimeline. In due course will become available for somewhere for people to watch, and we'll probably advertise that in due course. Our next talk is on the 22nd of July. It's about modern slavery and human trafficking, and be presented by Ben Douglas-Jones, James Marsland and Chris Jenkins. A bit of a bumper session. We're advertising that over the course of the next few weeks, and there'll be links and things of that nature going out about that in due course. Thanks very much to everyone who listened today and everyone who's due to listen, and we will see you again soon. Goodbye.